I spent 40 years jumping into forest fires, thinking I knew exactly what a miracle looked like. Usually, it was a change in the wind or a sudden rain. But I never expected a miracle to have fur, needle-sharp claws, and the power to fix a heart that I thought was broken beyond repair. Silas Vance was a man built from granite and cedar. At 68 years old, his hands were a roadmap of every fire he'd fought and every mile he'd hiked through the jagged peaks of the northern Cascades. He lived in a cabin that felt less like a home and more like a fortress against the world, perched on a ridge where the air was so thin it felt like breathing diamonds. For Silas, the silence wasn't a choice, it was a consequence. 3 years ago, the light in that cabin had gone out when his wife, Elena, passed away. She had been the mountain queen, a wildlife photographer who could charm a marmot out of its burrow with nothing but a soft whistle. Since she left, the house had grown cold in a way that no wood stove could fix. Silas kept a rigid military-like routine. Wake at 0500, brew coffee strong enough to dissolve a spoon, and patrol the perimeter of his land. It wasn't that he was looking for anything. He was just trying to outrun the memories that lived in the corners of the rooms. He spent his days maintaining his old bush plane, a vintage de Havilland Beaver that he'd restored with Elena decades ago. She used to sit in the co-pilot's seat, her long hair tucked under a headset, pointing out eagles in the thermal vents. Now the co-pilot's seat held only dust and the heavy weight of things unsaid. The ghost of the Great Fire. The summer of 2026 had been a brutal one. The valley below was choked with a haze of orange smoke from a distant blaze locals called the Omen Fire. Silas watched the horizon every evening from his porch, his eyes narrowed, reading the behavior of the smoke like a general watching an enemy army. He had spent his career as a lead smoke jumper, dropping into the heart of hell with nothing but a parachute and a Pulaski axe. He knew fire. He knew how it breathed, how it lied, and how it took everything you loved if you turned your back for even a second. One Tuesday afternoon, the wind shifted. It wasn't a strong wind, but it carried the scent of scorched pine and something else, something metallic and sharp. Silas felt a prickle at the back of his neck. He climbed into his rugged, customized 4x4, a beast of a machine he'd outfitted for the rough mountain tracks, and headed toward the eastern ridge. He told himself he was just checking the fire line, but in truth, he felt a pull toward the valley that he couldn't explain. A tragedy in the ash. As he reached the base of a blackened slope where a localized spot fire had flared up and died out the night before, Silas saw it. A massive mountain lion lay draped across the charred remains of a fallen hemlock. She was magnificent, even in her stillness. Her coat was a tawny gold, now marred by soot and the cruel marks of the fire. Silas stopped the truck, the engine idling with a low rumble that seemed disrespectful in the presence of death. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the layer of gray ash that covered the ground like a shroud. He approached the lioness with the practiced caution of a man who respected the wild. She was gone, likely caught by a falling limb during the heat of the blaze. "I'm sorry, girl," Silas whispered, his voice raspy from years of smoke inhalation. He reached down to touch her cold shoulder, a gesture of solidarity from one old hunter to another. That's when the ground moved. A small, high-pitched chirp, almost like a bird, but more desperate, pierced the silence. Silas froze. He watched the lioness's underbelly. From beneath the heavy protection of her flank, two tiny heads emerged. They were mountain lion cubs, no bigger than a pair of thick wool socks. Their blue eyes were barely open, squinting against the harsh light, and their coats were covered in the spots that would eventually fade as they grew. They weren't just hungry, they were terrified. They had been clinging to their mother's cooling body, seeking warmth from a source that could no longer provide it. The decision. Silas felt a familiar ache in his chest, the hollow, as he called it. His first instinct, the one honed by years of survival, told him to leave. Nature is a closed loop, he told himself. Interfering only breaks the gear. He thought about the work involved, the mess, the inevitable heartbreak when they grew too wild to keep. He thought about his quiet, controlled life, and how easily these two tiny creatures would shatter it. He turned back toward his truck. He took 3 steps. Then he remembered Elena. He remembered the time she had spent 3 days in a freezing rainstorm just to move a nest of grounded owlets to a safer branch. He remembered her saying, "Silas, we don't save them because we have to. We save them because we're the only ones who can." He stopped. He looked at the sky, then back at the cubs. One of them, the smaller of the two, let out a wavering cry and tried to crawl toward him, its tiny paws slipping on the ash. Silas stripped off his heavy canvas work jacket. The mountain air bit at his arms, but he didn't feel the cold. He knelt in the soot, his knees staining black, and gently scooped the 2 kittens into the lining of the jacket. They were lighter than he expected, their hearts beating like frantic drums against his palms. "All right," he grumbled, though his eyes were suspiciously bright. "But don't think this means we're friends. You're just cargo. That's all." The first night of chaos. The drive back to the cabin was the longest 10 miles of Silas's life. The cubs, whom he'd tucked into a tool crate lined with his softest flannel shirt, did not stop crying. It was a sound that bypassed the ears and went straight to the soul. When he reached the cabin, the reality of what he had done hit him like a landslide. He had no milk, no supplies, and no idea how to mother 2 apex predators. He spent the next 3 hours frantically searching through Elena's old wildlife journals. He found her notes on emergency feline care and began a makeshift chemistry experiment in his kitchen. He mixed goat's milk, egg yolks, and a drop of corn syrup, warming it until it was exactly body temperature. He didn't have a bottle, so he used an old glass eyedropper he found in a first aid kit. The larger cub, a male with a defiant streak already visible in the way he hissed at the shadows, fought the dropper at first. He scratched Silas's thumb, drawing a thin line of red. "Go ahead," Silas muttered. "I've been bitten by worse than you." Eventually, hunger won. The cub latched onto the dropper, his tiny paws kneading Silas's hand. The smaller female was more hesitant, her breathing shallow. Silas had to hold her against his bare chest, letting his own body heat seep into her chilled fur, whispering nonsense stories about bush piloting and mountain storms until she finally took a few drops of the formula. The shift in the shadows. By 3 a.m., Silas was exhausted. He sat in his armchair by the fire, the 2 cubs finally asleep in a bundle of fur on his lap. The cabin wasn't silent anymore. There was the crackle of the logs, the rhythmic breathing of the kittens, and the strange, forgotten sensation of being needed. He looked around the room. For the first time in 3 years, the shadows didn't look like ghosts. They just looked like shadows. He looked down at the male cub, who had a small white patch on his chest. "I'll call you Cinder," he whispered. Then he looked at the female, whose eyes had caught the firelight for a brief second before she drifted off. "And you're Nova, because you came out of the dark." Silas leaned his head back and closed his eyes. He knew that part 2 of this journey would be harder. He knew they would grow, they would destroy his furniture, and they would eventually challenge him. But as Cinder let out a tiny, contented sigh in his sleep, Silas Vance realized that for the first time since the funeral, he wasn't thinking about the past. He was wondering what he was going to feed them for breakfast. For Silas Vance, order was not just a habit. It was a survival mechanism developed over decades of jumping into forest fires. His cabin had always been a place of military-grade precision. Every tool in its place, every surface wiped clean, and a silence so profound you could hear the pine needles hitting the roof. But within 2 weeks of bringing Cinder and Nova home, that order had been systematically dismantled by 8 pounds of spotted fur and chaos. The first thing to go was Silas's rigid sleep schedule. He had spent years training his body to sleep through anything, a skill from his service days, but he quickly learned that a mountain lion kitten's cry is a frequency that the human brain is biologically incapable of ignoring. He found himself setting alarms for every 2 hours, stumbling into the kitchen with eyes like burned holes in a blanket to prepare the specialized formula. Feeding was the first fail. While the female, Nova, was patient, Cinder was a whirlwind of claws and desperation. He would frequently shove his sister aside, his small body trembling with a hunger that seemed bottomless. Silas's large, scarred hands that had dismantled airplane engines and dug fire lines, now learned a terrifying kind of gentleness as he held the tiny, squirming lives in his palm. One night, Cinder decided the dropper wasn't fast enough and launched himself at Silas's beard, convinced it was a source of milk. Silas ended up with a face full of lukewarm formula and a kitten clinging to his chin like a burr. It was the first time Silas had laughed in years, a dry, rusty sound that startled even him. The demolition crew. As the kittens grew, their baby fluff began to give way to sleeker, more muscular coats. Their wild instincts, dormant for the first few days of survival, erupted with the force of a mountain slide. Silas had vastly underestimated what it meant to live with big cats in a small space. The cat logic became a daily reality. Nova discovered that the heavy velvet curtains Elena had hung years ago weren't just window dressings. They were the ultimate climbing gym. Silas would walk into the living room to find her perched near the ceiling, looking down with a mix of triumph and confusion, her needle-sharp claws having shredded the fabric into expensive ribbons. Cinder, meanwhile, developed an obsession with gravity. He learned that if he swiped a coffee mug off the table, it made a satisfying crash that brought the tall human running. Silas lost 3 of his favorite ceramic mugs in a single 48-hour period. He tried to move everything breakable to higher shelves, but he soon realized that for a mountain lion, there is no such thing as a high shelf. The furniture, once pristine, began to bear the marks of their species, scratches and gouges that served as a map of their nightly mock battles. Silas found himself sitting amidst the wreckage of his controlled life, realizing that perfect order was no longer possible, and strangely, he didn't even want it back. The shattered memory. The most difficult moment of the early months came on a rainy Tuesday. Silas had a single photograph of Elena on the small side table by his armchair. A candid shot of her laughing at a summer barbecue, her eyes crinkled with the joy he missed every single day. It was his most prized possession. He returned from the woodshed to find the frame on the floor. The glass was shattered, and the photograph itself had deep claw marks raked across Elena's face. Cinder was sitting nearby, batting a piece of the frame's backing around like a toy, looking entirely pleased with himself. Silas froze. A surge of old, hot anger rose in his chest, followed immediately by a crushing wave of grief. For a moment, he looked at the kittens and saw only the destruction of his past. But as he knelt to pick up the ruined photo, Nova walked over and placed her head in his hand, a silent, steady presence. The anger dissolved as quickly as it had come. He looked at the kittens' innocent, wild faces and realized that Elena wouldn't have been angry. She would have been fascinated. He smoothed the torn corner of the picture, placed it in a new frame, and moved it to the highest mantelpiece. The hollow in his chest didn't disappear, but the sharp edges of it felt a little softer. A call for backup. Recognizing he was in over his head, Silas finally reached out to an old contact, Dr. Elias Hawthorne, a veterinarian who had worked with Elena on several wildlife rehabilitation projects years ago. He hesitated before dialing, having avoided contact with their old friends since the funeral. The phone rang, and when Eris picked up, the familiar voice acted as a bridge to a world Silas had abandoned. Silas felt awkward at first, struggling to explain why he had 2 mountain lion cubs in his kitchen. But Eris didn't judge. He gave detailed instructions on nutrition, warned Silas about the teenager phase that was coming, and told him what signs of illness to watch for. They talked long after the medical advice was finished. For the first time, Silas shared the story of how he found them, and Eris shared stories of Elena that Silas hadn't heard before. When he hung up, Silas realized he hadn't just gotten help for the cats. He had reconnected with his own humanity. The ritual of the meal. As the weeks turned into months, a strange behavior emerged in Nova. She refused to eat her meals unless Silas was physically present in the room, sitting within a few feet of her. He discovered this when he left her bowl down and went to check the weather radio, only to find the food untouched 20 minutes later while Cinder was already eyeing her portion. Silas tried everything to break the habit, hiding around corners, watching through the window, but Nova would simply sit and wait, her golden eyes fixed on the door until he returned. It wasn't about the food. It was about the security of the pack. Silas eventually accepted his role, using the time she spent eating to drink his own coffee and speak to them in a low, steady voice. The 3 shadows. By the end of the first season, the cabin had transformed. The smell of pine and gun oil had been replaced by a musky, wild scent that Silas grew to find comforting. The silence was gone, replaced by the clatter of kittens sliding across wooden floors, the low growls of their play fighting, and the rhythmic thrum of their purrs that seemed to vibrate the very walls of the cabin. One evening, as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, casting long, orange light through the windows, Silas looked at the floor. He saw 3 shadows stretching across the wood, 1 man and 2 growing lions. "This is enough," he whispered to the empty room, or perhaps to Elena. He had a reason to wake up that didn't involve a clock. He had lives that depended on him, and in the process of keeping them safe, he was starting to realize that they were the ones keeping him alive. But as he watched Cinder unsuccessfully try to pounce on a dust mote and end up doing a somersault into the woodbox, Silas knew the real challenges were only just beginning. The cubs were getting bigger, stronger, and their curiosity was starting to extend beyond the cabin walls. By the time the late spring thaw began to pull the silver veil of winter off the Flathead Forest, Elias Hawthorne realized his life was no longer his own. A 70-year-old man with white hair kept in a strict military style, Elias had spent decades valuing the rigid sleep schedule and perfect order that defined his service years. But the bobcats, Rook and Lumen, had other plans. Their wild nature emerged not as a sudden storm, but as a gradual, unstoppable tide. The cabin, once silent enough to hear the ticking of an old clock, now echoed with the sounds of organic chaos. Elias found himself adapting, learning that his military precision had to give way to something organic and responsive. He began to read their body language, the flattening of an ear, the twitch of a tail. He moved his few remaining breakables to the highest shelves, finally accepting that his furniture would be scratched and his perfect order was a relic of a past life that no longer served him. The night of the Great Shadow. The transition from pets to protectors happened on a night in late spring. The forest was heavy with the scent of damp earth and budding pine. Elias was pulled from sleep, not by an alarm, but by a sound that triggered every survival instinct he possessed. Heavy, shuffling footsteps and a low, guttural grunt just outside the cabin door. He moved with the practiced silence of a soldier, grabbing the flashlight by his bed. In the beam of light, he saw a massive black bear, a magnificent and terrifying beast weighing several hundred pounds, sniffing around the porch. Before Elias could reach for a deterrent, a shadow blurred past him. Rook, the darker and more mischievous of the pair, leapt onto the window ledge. The bobcat didn't cower. His fur stood on end, doubling his size, and he released a hiss that sounded like tearing metal. Rook wasn't just defending a territory. He was preparing to launch himself through the door to confront the predator. Elias let out a parade ground bark, grabbing Rook mid-leap as he kicked the door shut and threw the deadbolt. He held the trembling, snarling bobcat against his chest for a long time, feeling their hearts hammer in unison as the bear eventually ambled back into the darkness. In that adrenaline-soaked silence, Elias whispered a promise. "No one is taking you away from me ever again." They weren't just animals anymore, they were family. The Harley and the wild. A few months later, as the forest turned a vibrant, living green, Elias decided to reintroduce a piece of his history to his new family. He wheeled his vintage Harley-Davidson out of the shed. For years, this bike had been a vessel for his grief, a way to ride the curves he once shared with his late wife, Anwin. Rook and Lumen watched from the porch with intense interest. As a joke, Elias patted the leather seat and said, "Come on then." He never expected what happened next. Rook jumped up immediately, landing with surprising grace, followed quickly by Lumen. They sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead as if they had been born to ride. When Elias started the engine, the Harley roared to life with a deep-throated song. Most animals would have bolted, but the bobcats merely tensed, gripping the seat with their claws as Elias began to roll forward slowly. By the end of that afternoon, they hadn't just made it to the end of the driveway. They had established a new ritual. Elias modified the seats with textured grips to help them hold on. Soon, the three of them were roaming the forest roads together, an old man with a white beard and two fully grown bobcats sitting on either side of him like passengers. The spectacle of the road. As they ventured further, the townspeople grew accustomed to the extraordinary sight. Elias remained protective, never letting strangers approach the cats. Rook, ever the comrade, would position himself between Elias and anyone who drew too close, his message of guardianship silent but clear. One day, searching through a box of Anwin's old things, Elias found 2 pairs of aviator goggles from their younger riding days. He strapped them onto the bobcats. When Lumen saw her reflection in the bike's mirror, her expression of confusion mixed with vanity was so comic that Elias laughed until he cried, a sound of pure joy that echoed through the pines. The hollow in his chest was still there, but it no longer consumed him. He had a purpose beyond mere habit. As they rode into the wind, with Rook's ears flat against his skull and Lumen clinging to the seat like she was riding a rocket into space, Elias Hawthorne realized that the road didn't just hold memories of the dead. It held the vibrant, messy, and beautiful life of the living. By the 3rd year, the rhythm of the cabin was set, but a quiet pressure began to build in Elias's heart. It wasn't the pressure of a coming storm, but the weight of a promise made in a room filled with the sterile scent of antiseptic and the rhythmic hum of hospital monitors. Beside Anwin's bed, in those final days when time had become a liquid, slipping through his fingers, Elias had made a vow. They had planned a cross-state journey for decades, from the rugged peaks of Montana all the way to the California coast, where she had always dreamed of watching the sunset melt into the Pacific Ocean. Next summer, they would always say. But next summer never came for Anwin. In her final morphine-hazed hours, she had asked him if he remembered the plan. He had held her hand, his thumb tracing her knuckles, and promised her that he would go. He promised he would see it for her and carry some part of her to that western shore on the back of the Harley they both loved. Crafting the vessel. Fulfilling that promise meant more than just packing a bag. It required a physical vessel for the memories. Elias retreated to his small workshop, the air smelling of sawdust and old oil. From a piece of the cabin's original construction, wood that had sheltered them for 30 years, he crafted a small wooden box. It was simple and unadorned, shaped by his own scarred hands to hold her ashes. He secured the box carefully to the Harley, positioning it right behind the seat where she had once wrapped her arms around his waist for 32 years. It was a sacred cargo. On either side of that seat, the spots were reserved for Rook and Lumen. They were fully grown now, magnificent predators with thick, healthy coats and powerful, lean bodies. They were no longer just the kittens he'd rescued from the asphalt. They were the guardians of his remaining joy. The logistics of the wild. Traveling 1,500 miles with two apex predators was a challenge that required the precision of a military operation. Elias mapped out the route with obsessive detail, choosing back roads and dirt tracks to avoid the frantic pace of the major highways where they might draw the wrong kind of attention. He packed camping gear, a small tent, and enough specialized food to keep the bobcats healthy through changing climates. His old friend, Dr. Tamsin Vale, provided him with emergency medical supplies and enough sedative to handle any crisis, though Elias hoped the bond they shared would be enough to keep them calm. On a clear morning in May, with the air still crisp enough to bite, Elias turned the key. The Harley roared to life, a deep-throated growl that signaled the beginning of their pilgrimage into the infinite landscape. The first day, they covered 200 miles of Montana's winding roads. Elias stopped frequently, not for himself, but to let Rook and Lumen stretch their powerful limbs and explore the sense of a changing world. As they moved, the bobcats developed their own road logic. Rook became the serious passenger. When sleepiness set in after hours of wind, he would rest his heavy head against Elias's shoulder, his weight solid, warm, and entirely trusting. Lumen, ever the observer, developed a habit that brought tears to Elias's eyes under his helmet. She would occasionally reach forward and place a single, tufted paw on the wooden storage box containing Anwin's ashes. It was as if she understood the weight of what they carried. She watched the American landscape slide past, birds, clouds, and moving shadows, with a calm intensity that mirrored Elias's own. They crossed through the majesty of mountain passes where the air grew thin and cold, rising above the tree line into a world of stone and sky. They descended into deserts where the heat shimmered off the asphalt like a mirage, making the horizon waver. They even rode through the eerie, blackened cathedrals of scorched forests, where black snags stood like grave markers, a somber reminder of the fires Elias had once fought. Conversations with a ghost. To pass the time, and to keep his heart from breaking under the weight of the scenery, Elias talked. He spoke into the wind, but he wasn't talking to the bobcats, he was talking to Anwin. He told her about the two rescue comedians sitting on either side of him. He described the way the light hit the canyon walls and how Rook had tried to hiss at a passing tumbleweed. At every rest stop, they were a mythic and strange spectacle. An old man with a white beard, two lynx-like creatures, and a motorcycle that carried the sound of nostalgia. Some people approached with cameras, asking for photos of the bobcat grandpa. Others stayed back, eyes wide with a mix of fear and awe, wondering if the old man was entirely sane. Elias only smiled, answering their questions with a polite brevity, always keeping Rook positioned as a silent barrier between his family and the world. At night, they camped in the isolation of national forests, away from the noise of established campgrounds. Under the vast starlit canopy, the bobcats would explore the perimeter of the tent, their eyes glowing like small lanterns in the dark, before returning to sleep on the pads Elias had laid out for them. They were moving forward, not just across the map, but through the landscape of grief itself. Each mile was a stitch, sewing the hollow in his chest back together with the thread of a fulfilled promise. The air changed before the horizon did. After days of traversing the scorched forests and the shimmering heat of the desert, the wind shifted, carrying a heavy, damp coolness that smelled of brine and ancient kelp. Elias felt it first in his lungs, a sharpness that tasted of life and vastness. Behind him, he felt Rook shift on the modified seat, the bobcat's nose twitching as he sampled a scent that existed nowhere in the high pines of Montana. They were descending through the coastal range, where the trees grew into giants. The redwoods stood like the pillars of a forgotten cathedral, their trunks so wide they seemed to swallow the sound of the Harley's engine. Elias rode slowly here, the light filtering through the canopy in dusty, golden shafts. He could feel the weight of the small wooden box behind him, the one he had crafted with his own hands from the cabin's very bones. It felt heavier now, as if the proximity to their destination was giving them memories of physical gravity. Lumen leaned into the curve with him, her golden eyes wide and alert. She had become a seasoned traveler, her earlier vanity replaced by a stoic, quiet observation of the unfolding world. As the forest began to thin and the roar of the engine was joined by a low, rhythmic thrumming from the west, Elias knew they had arrived. The first sight of the infinite. They emerged from the treeline onto a rugged, northern stretch of the California coast. Elias had chosen this spot carefully, a quiet beach far north of the neon lights and tourist traps, accessible only by a crumbling dirt road that most vehicles wouldn't dare to traverse. He brought the Harley to a halt on a high bluff overlooking the Pacific. The engine clicked as it began to cool, the silence of the coast rushing in to fill the void. Rook and Lumen didn't jump off immediately. They sat on the bike, their ears swiveling toward the sound of the breakers. They had never seen the ocean before. To a creature of the mountains, the sea is an impossibility, a forest of water that never stands still. They watched the white foam hiss against the dark sand with a mixture of caution and profound curiosity. Elias dismounted, his joints stiff from the long journey. He reached back and unstrapped the wooden box with steady hands. He felt a strange calm. The hollow in his chest, that physical space where something vital had been removed when Anwin died, was still there, but it didn't feel like a wound anymore. It felt like a vessel, much like the box in his hands. Tracks in the sand. "Come on then," he whispered. He led the two bobcats down the narrow path to the beach. Their paws left deep, distinctive tracks in the damp sand, marks that the incoming tide would soon erase. Rook approached the water first, his tail twitching in agitation as a small wave rushed toward his feet. He hissed at the foam, a sound like tearing metal, before jumping back with a surprised chirp that made Elias smile. Lumen was more reserved. She stood on a dry patch of sand, her eyes tracking the movement of the gulls. She seemed to be sensing the scale of the world, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the blue of the water met the purple of the approaching dusk. The sun began its final descent, painting the sky in violent shades of orange, gold, and deep purple. It was exactly the sunset Anwin had dreamed of watching. She had spoken of this light in her final days, her voice a haze of morphine and memories, asking him if he remembered their plan. The fulfillment of the vow. Elias stood at the water's edge, the surf cold against his boots. He opened the lid of the wooden box. He didn't say a long prayer. He had spent the last 1,500 miles talking to her already. He simply reached in and let the wind take what remained of her. As he let the ashes go, the coastal breeze caught them, scattering them over the white-capped waves she had always wanted to see. In the dying light, some of the ashes caught the sun, glinting like stars for a fleeting second before vanishing into the Pacific. "I've kept my promise, my love," he whispered into the roar of the sea. He did not cry. He felt too full for tears. He placed his hand over his heart, feeling the steady beat that refused to give up. For the first time in 3 years, he didn't feel like a man who was waiting for the end. He felt like a man who had completed a mission and was now standing at the start of a new one. The three who remained. The three of them stood there as darkness began to fall over the coast. The bobcats eventually settled beside him, their fur damp with the salt spray. Rook leaned his weight against Elias's leg, a solid and trusting presence that anchored him to the present moment. The ocean continued its eternal sound, water meeting land, life meeting the infinite. Elias looked at Rook and Lumen, the wild comrades who had pulled him out of the silence of his cabin and the stagnation of his grief. They were his family now, recognized not just by the shared road, but by the fact that they had saved each other. As the stars began to appear, mirroring the glint of the ashes in the water, Elias turned back toward the bluff where the Harley waited. The journey to the coast was over, but the journey home was just beginning. And for the first time, home didn't feel like a fortress of solitude. It felt like a destination worth reaching. The journey back from the Pacific coast was not a retreat. It was a victory lap for a man who had finally settled his accounts with the past. As the Harley-Davidson hummed across the expansive, sun-bleached flats of Nevada, Elias Hawthorne felt a lightness in his chest that had been absent for years. The wooden box behind him was empty of ashes, but the space where he once carried his grief was now filled with the solid, vibrating presence of Rook and Lumen. They rode through the high desert, where the heat shimmered off the asphalt and the horizon seemed to stretch into forever, three figures bound by a bond that defied conventional logic. On this return trip, Elias felt a sudden, sharp clarity about the future. He realized that while he had fulfilled his promise to Anwin, he now had a new responsibility to the living. He wasn't just an old soldier waiting for the clock to run out. He was the patriarch of a very strange, very wild family. Making it official, the Hawthorne legacy. In a small, dusty town in Nevada, Elias did something entirely unplanned but fundamentally necessary. He pulled the Harley up in front of a modest lawyer's office. With his white beard wind-tossed and his leather jacket smelling of salt and sagebrush, he walked inside and asked a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s about the process for legally registering Rook and Lumen as his family. The lawyer looked at the two magnificent bobcats waiting patiently by the motorcycle, and then back at the determined old man. "You mean like emotional support animals?" she asked, her voice skeptical. "No," Elias replied firmly. "I mean family." It took weeks of research, creative paperwork, and a series of complex negotiations with wildlife officials. Because the bobcats were non-releasable due to their long-term imprinting on humans, and because Elias held the proper permits and had maintained impeccable veterinary oversight with Dr. Tamsin Vale, a unique legal bridge was formed. They were officially registered as permanent companion animals under his care, a status that finally reflected the reality of their lives. When the documents were finally notarized, three names appeared together on the civil records: Elias Hawthorne, Rook Hawthorne, and Lumen Hawthorne. As he tucked the papers into his jacket pocket, Elias felt a sense of completeness he hadn't known since his wedding day. They were legally, as well as spiritually, a pack. The Medal of Valor. Back at the cabin in the Montana woods, life settled into a rhythm that was organic and responsive. One afternoon, while Elias was organizing his gear, Rook, ever the unruly and curious explorer, began investigating an old wardrobe. He dragged out a tarnished metal case containing a war medal Elias had been awarded decades ago, but had never seen fit to display. Rook carried the medal in his mouth like a prize, dropping it at Elias's feet with a look of expectant pride. Elias picked up the medal, the faded ribbon a stark contrast to his scarred hands. He remembered the fire, the noise, and the young man he had once been. In a sudden, moved gesture, Elias tied the medal around Rook's neck with a soft leather cord. Rook sat perfectly still, sensing the gravity of the moment. "From now on," Elias whispered, "you're my comrade." It was a title Rook had earned not through war, but through the daily battle of pulling an old man back from the brink of despair. The quiet wisdom of Lumen. While Rook was the boisterous comrade, Lumen remained the quiet anchor. On a gray afternoon when the rain drummed a relentless rhythm on the cabin roof, Elias found himself lost in a fog of memory, the hollow in his chest briefly aching with the ghost of Anwin's laughter. Without a sound, Lumen walked over and placed her head directly in his hand. She didn't demand food or play. She simply offered the weight of her life against his. It was a small moment of connection, animal to human, that melted his heart and pulled him back into the present where she waited. She was his lantern in the dark, her golden eyes always watching, always grounding him in the here and now. The birth of Bobcat Grandpa. The local community, once wary of the old man and his wild companions, had transformed their curiosity into a strange kind of affection. A neighboring family had moved in nearby, and their young child had taken to calling out from the road whenever the Harley roared past. "Hello, Bobcat Grandpa," the child would wave enthusiastically. The nickname, which started as a joke, became a badge of honor for Elias. He was no longer the solitary soldier or the grieving widower. He was a town legend, a living reminder that love takes many forms and that it is never too late for a new beginning. The road without end. As the third summer since the rescue drew to a close, Elias sat on his porch, watching Rook and Lumen chase each other through the tall grass in the glow of the sunset. The cabin was no longer a place of silence. It was a home filled with the clatter of life, the musky scent of the wild, and the purpose of caretaking. He understood now that life doesn't just end with death. It persists. He carried Anwin with him, not as a weight, but as a foundation. Every morning brought the possibility of a new ride, the wind in his face, and his two wild family members at his side. The road still held the curves they had once ridden together, but now it held new tracks, the paw prints of bobcats and the tire marks of a man who had chosen to keep going. As the three of them disappeared once more into the pine forest as afternoon turned to evening, it was clear that this was not an ending. It was a continuation, a proof that as long as there is something worth caring for, every ride is a reminder that you are alive and your story is still being written.